Hello everyone, and welcome to our very first YouTube lecture for the 2015-2016 school year. Yay, APUSH! Yeah! It's awesome! I can't get enough! Oh well, that's always my dream, to go into a room and just thousands of cheering students, right? Never gonna happen. So what these YouTube lectures are for are to give you a lot of background information, to go a little bit more into depth with the content knowledge, tie them into the key concepts that we will talk a lot about in class, and to reinforce your learning experience. It's going to be very important for you that you do pay attention to these lectures, that you take notes when I ask you to take notes, you look at the video logs that I'll place up on Edmodo, that you do these and prepare for your exams this way. As you'll learn in class, our study of APUSH history will be divided into 9 periods. This is period 1, which covers 1491 through 1607. It's one of the shorter periods to look at. We'll only spend a few days on it, and I'll introduce you right away here to our key concepts. In every period, there will be 2 to 3 key concepts. This is, like I said, one of our shorter periods of study, so there are only 2 key concepts you need to know. Key concept 1.1, that stands for period 1, and the first concept, and in period 1.2, well, that's again period 1, and the second concept. And I'll underline information especially that should stand out and be important to you. Our first concept talks about our native populations that are migrating here to the Americas, to North America specifically. But as they did so, notice they developed distinct and increasingly complex societies. They adapt and transform to the environments. That's something that's very important to take note of. And in 2, notice I underline the Columbian exchange. As Europeans are coming over, since Christopher Columbus and afterwards, and when they start to import African slaves, and the interaction that begins to happen amongst the 3 various groups, the Columbian exchange happens. We often think of just food going from the Americas to Europe and from Europe to the Americas, but it was also an exchange of cultural ideas. It changes politics in both Europe and in the Americas. The Columbian exchange is very, very important as well. So let's look a little bit more in depth at key concept 1.1, and then you'll notice that they're divided into sub-concepts. Here's Roman numeral 1. Again, looking at these Native American societies. The very important thing to take note of that helped the development of these societies is the spread of maize. Maize cultivation is very important. As Indians began to understand the concepts of agriculture and began to spread from Mexico northward into North America, they brought with them the concept of maize cultivation, which led to advancements in irrigation. It brought about massive, complex societies that were very diverse. Some of them were hierarchical, some of them are caste systems, some of them are patriarchal, which meant they were male-dominated, and there are some that are matriarchal, which were female-dominated. Huge, complex systems of trade along the Mississippi River. Massive civilizations will be developed. Much of them will become extinct by the time that Columbus and Europe begins to arrive into the Americas. But there's a lot of archaeological findings that have been able to prove these were massive societies they were able to develop, and it stems from their development of maize. Other Indians that we'll talk about later on, we'll get into really the Great Basin and the Western Plains Indians. Those are our mobile Indians, our nomadic tribes. They never really settled down. Buffalo becomes a huge part of their life. Also fishing and navigating along the rivers. In the northeast and along the Atlantic seaboard, where the English eventually settled, they'll come across mixed agricultural and hunter-gatherer societies that develop very strong economies and permanent villages. And then in what is the Northwest and present-day California, we'll get that really towards the end, but again, hunting-gathering societies, societies that vast resources were dependent upon the ocean, which is quite obvious. If you're in California, up to what is present-day Washington State and Oregon into Canada, you'd understand why the ocean would be very important to these societies. Here's an example. Now, this is not in our key concepts, but there's a lot of examples that we can use and talk about, especially if we want to write essays. Oh my goodness, that was an evil word I just said. But yes, from time to time you'll be asked to write an essay, and you want to use some examples to prove these concepts that we're talking about. I also like to introduce you to a lot of secondary sources. We're going to look at a lot of primary sources, but secondary is just as important. Alan Taylor is an author. He wrote a very, very good book called American Colonies. I'll utilize some of this in our early few weeks here of school. And here he talks about two groups of Indians, the Hohokam and the Anasazi. And we write down here scholarly inventions because a lot of these Indians we'll talk about, the names that we're very familiar with are often just inventions because we really didn't know what they called themselves. As the French and the Dutch, the Spanish and the English begin to settle in, sometimes they'll just use their own language to give them names, and those names will stick all the way down to our time period. But these two civilizations were some of those early, very diverse, very advanced civilizations we were talking about. Between 300 and 1100 of our Common Era. Again, complex, populous cultures, developed politically independent villages. A very famous group are the Pueblo Indians. That's a Spanish word right there. We think of the Pueblo Indians, but that's actually a name that comes to us from Spain. They built what would look like condominiums along the sides of the mountain ranges. Never had any beast of burdens in their civilization, nor did they develop a writing system. They did use the wheel. They traded with peoples throughout Mexico. They created massive irrigation works, which demanded extensive and coordinated labor systems. Now think about that. If the Europeans, as they come over, and we'll talk a lot about this in class, will constantly label Indians as savages. And yet, we could prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that they had coordinated labor systems. They had workers, they had slaves, and they had paid labor in various cultures. What does that tell you about their society? Look here at their ceramic tradition. These Indians, this is how we know a lot about their histories from the pottery that we find behind. That's technology. In order to do something like this, you have to have a form of technology. Again, showing that the Indians throughout the Americas are highly advanced, but they're going to be very different than what Europeans are used to. Key concept 1.2 gets into the expansion of Europe as it comes into the Western Hemisphere. First you'll get the Spanish, a little bit of the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, and eventually the English. This will generate a lot of changing socially, religious, political, economic competition with the various European societies. We'll talk about some of the religious wars that take place in Europe. We'll talk about the economic trading systems that will develop to try to cut each other out, as it were, economically. Here's the Columbian exchange again. It's mentioned twice in the key concept, so that tells me it's a very important expression to get to know. And again, some of this stuff we'll talk more intently in class. Here's another good example. Part of the Columbian exchange isn't just food. A lot of people think, again, that it's all about food, but there's a lot of things that are going to go back and forth, and one of them will be disease. Again, going to Alan Taylor's American Colonies, he talks about the pathogens. Why was it so one-sided? Why did the Indians die so readily and the Europeans were not? Well, again, Europe had developed a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for, immunity towards these various diseases. But also, why did they never develop natural immunities? Well, if we take the idea that there was that land bridge that existed between Russia and what is Alaska, right? Sub-Arctic climate, disease, these pathogens, as Paleo-Indians are coming out of the Middle East and India and even out of Africa into this area, and they're migrating into what is present-day Russia, into Siberia, and eventually crossing the land bridge that would extend over in here into the Americas. They're not going to be exposed to these pathogens. as will those of Europe and parts of Africa because of the hotter climates. Factors why powerful pathogens developed in Europe, well, it's not just the fact that they have disease. Europeans begin to travel. They begin to travel long distances. They begin to trade with people in the Middle East, with people in Africa, so they began to become more exposed to other diseases. They traded with China, opening up even more exposure to these powerful pathogens. So Europeans, as you hopefully remember in your world history, the Black Plagues, these various plagues that would just wipe out millions of population at a time. But over time, Europeans became very used to this. Urbanization is also a problem for them. As they're building their big cities in Paris, in London, in Berlin, these are wooden cities without proper irrigation, without proper plumbing. This is going to cause a lot of nastiness, and we'll talk about that particular type of nastiness that is known as dysentery, and it just spreads a lot of disease. And again, Europeans became very much exposed to this over generations and generations. Throughout Europe, Africa, and Asia, they lived also with large number of domesticated animals, smallpox, swine flu. These are diseases that developed because of our constant contact with domesticated animals. The people of America did not domesticate animals, so they were not used to being among cattle. In fact, cattle and pigs do not exist in the Americas. That is something that's going to be, through the Columbian exchange, imported to the Americas. So again, if you were to write an essay or try to explain yourself as to why Europe, or actually I should say why the Americas were more highly susceptible to dying from the diseases than Europeans were, well, here it is. Europeans had already been exposed for generations and generations. The Native Americans were not. They did not build massive urban centers like they were in Europe. They didn't have long-distance trade, and they were not exposed to domesticated animals like Europeans and Africans and Asians were. Here are some vocabulary words you want to familiarize yourself with. I will put that often in the video logs so that you can kind of jot some of these things down and think about what they are. We talked about maize. We talked about the Great Basin and Great Plains. The Mississippi River is something that's going to be very important to us. Columbian exchange, joint stock companies, encomienda systems. We'll talk about that in class. These are the conquistadors, the Spanish, and their plantation system, where they own the land and they own the Indians on there as well, and a caste system. When you get your textbook, here's the reading that I expect that you will look at and read. And remember, when we have quizzes, some of the quizzes will be based on our YouTube videos. Some of them will be based on our reading in our textbook. So you can pause at this moment and jot down just a few pages. It's really just a few pages of information I want you to just look at. I'm looking forward to a great year, and I hope this first video wasn't too painful for you, and because there's going to be many more. Sorry. Okay, we'll see everybody later. Bye-bye.